So our next painting, our vanitas painting, we are going to use a different type of underpainting technique called a grisaille underpainting. Grisaille is a term for painting executed entirely in monochrome or near monochrome, usually in shades of gray. The unique part about this underpainting process is that instead of like the two previous processes that we use, where you start off sort of loose in general, the grisaille process you start out very detailed and specific, but we're taking away all of the complexity of color. So you're just focusing on the tonal values, the black and white, and we're going to actually add the color in glazing layers. So this is what originally was the underpainting for the Grand Odalisque. You can see here all that detail of the folds of the fabric and everything has come through in the finished piece. And the really interesting part about the grisaille underpainting process is that you really go for the details initially. So things that are very difficult, like hair or folds of fabric, or very detailed interactions, actually become easier in the grisaille process because we're not focusing in all that variation of color. You've limited yourself to just looking at value. Now this process also dates all the way back to the Renaissance. The first artist who is known to really use and master this technique is Leonardo da Vinci. There's sort of a little known fact about Da Vinci that he only has finished 12 known pieces in his lifetime, but he has many, many examples of unfinished pieces. So we get to look at examples of how he would start his paintings. So this work here, you can actually see several different layers of completion. If you see the figure in the middle, the Madonna and Child, that's actually his underdrawing layer. So you can see he has mapped out all of the figures. The figures to the right is where he's actually started to go into the grisaille underpainting. So he's fully developing all of those figures in detail in black and white. So he's mapping out all of the value first. And what Da Vinci was known for, he was known for capturing the beauty of those folds of fabric and sort of the gentle variation and changes of skin. That's one of those things that the grisaille underpainting process can do. It can really allow you to focus in on how light sort of goes across the subject. So many, many artists have used this process since then, just because of its ability to allow the artist to capture detail. The one downside to the grisaille underpainting process is it tends to have a darker overall look, especially when we just use black and white. For that reason, sometimes artists will actually use browns or something else instead, but for the simplicity and sort of understanding this process for the first time, we are going to only use black and white. So the goal is, like I said, in the first layer of this painting, you will have every detail mapped out. In the subsequent layers, we're only going to focus on color. So you'll actually almost colorize your piece the same way that they used to colorize old black and white film. So think about, this first process is very important. You really have to think about those details in your still life. The grisaille underpainting should look like a completely finished black and white painting. You're not going to go in and make any major changes. once that black and white painting is done. Your first layer should be thick and not washy like your previous paintings, so we're not going to really water down the paint like we did before with either water or Gamsol. We're going to try to keep the paint more opaque in that first layer. So for oil paintings, that means we're going to use oil paint that is undiluted, so not so washy with the Gamsol like we did before. So you're going to just be using the paint directly from the tube, not watered down. If you need to add fluidity, you can still add a little bit of Gamsol in the first layer, but only a small amount as needed. We're going to use our 2-part classic medium once we get into the glazing layers of this piece. If you're using acrylic paint for this painting, you can use the retarder to slow down the dry time when painting opaquely. You can also use the 2-part slow dry medium when you need to add fluidity as needed. So sometimes the retarder doesn't really add as much fluidity. That's when you're going to go ahead and still use your 2-part slow dry medium. Now remember, the details are important, so you're going to take your time. You're going to have 2 weeks to complete the black and white layer. It does not all have to be done this week. We're going to have a check-in just to see where you're at the end of this week, and then the actual black and white layer will be due at the end of next week.